Hi, welcome to Healthy Monadnock Heartbeat. I'm Sarah Caseta, your host for the show. Thanks for joining us today. Today we have an opportunity to hear from Linda Rubin, the director of the Healthy Community Initiative. She'll be talking to us about what Healthy Monadnock has been up to lately, where they came from, and especially about the 5th annual Healthiest Community Summit that is coming up in May, on May 17th. So welcome, Linda. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Sarah. Glad to be here.
So can we start with just a big overview of Healthy Monadnock, when it started, who's involved, what it means? It's obviously here on our show, but I'd love to make sure everyone knows, because I think there can be some confusion in the community.
Yeah, sure. So Healthy Monadnock started back in 2007 with a really big idea from a handful of people who thought it would be cool to live in the healthiest community in the nation and start to think about, well, what would it take for us to get there? And while it was kicked off at Cheshire Medical Center, Dartmouth Hitchcock Keene, the hospital knew quite early on that they were not going to be able to, achieve that vision on their own. So launching this initiative was really about how do we engage the community in working on the kinds of system and environmental changes that would support people to be healthier. So over the last bunch of years we have determined, well, what are those strategies, what are going to make the most difference, who are the partners in our area that can actually implement them at a scale that'll make a difference to the health of the population, and how do we sort of build grassroots support at the citizen level to advocate for the kinds of environments that do make it easier to be healthy, whether it's at school, work, in our neighborhoods, in our towns.
That's great, and that's what we're hoping to do on this show, is have a lot of those partners in the community come in and talk about what they're working on and how those strategies are being enforced, or not enforced, but carried out. So it's been great. We've had a lot of great guests. So this group, the Healthiest Community Initiative, also works on summits and community summits. Why do you hold summits?
So as a community engagement initiative, the role that the Cheshire Medical Center really plays, and the staff that's involved with Healthy Monadnock, we're considered what's called the backbone organization for an initiative like this, where we're overseeing things like that grassroots engagement. How do we get people to support the kind of changes that have to take place in our environment? How do we align them with the strategies? How do we select the strategies? How do we identify the partners? How do we educate the public about the kind of things that are really going to matter? So there's a lot of education and awareness that's part of the work of the backbone staff. And these community summits help to create that opportunity for community dialogue around either new topic areas or areas that highlight a specific action theme that is in the Healthy Monadnock plan, but maybe there isn't quite enough capacity, or there isn't quite enough sort of grassroots energy, activity, understanding around a specific issue, and we really use those summits to spark the grassroots engagement in some of these bigger topic areas.
So let's try to tell me some examples.
Sure. So back in our first summit in 2010, we invited Mark Fenton, he was an Olympic race walker and had his own PBS show called America Walking, and now he's a national expert on how do communities create environments in which it's safe for people to bike and walk and use transportation, public transportation, because if you look at the data around physical activity, only about 25% of the population since the 1960s have been recorded as participating in structured physical activity. One of the big strategies to work on in communities is, if only 25% are going to join the Y, or a dance class, or some kind of structured thing, a health club, what's going to happen to the other 75% to ensure that they are able to be physically active, which will support their overall health and well-being. And so having safe streets, having sidewalks and crosswalks and signage and trails, and have it being safe for people to maybe within a mile radius of their home, start to do errands, that it's not just about physical activity for recreation, but they also actually start incorporating it into their daily life, and it's not called exercise.
Yeah.
It's just part of what we do as a community. So Mark Fenton really helped our community to understand at a much higher level. We were already sort of heading down that road, but he really helped us understand at a higher level how much that those kinds of things could impact the health of our population. And we brought him back a second time to work with some leaders in our community and coalitions, and 5-6 years later, we have quite a number of initiatives that are happening in support of improving the environments in which we all live that make it easier for people to walk and bike.
Yep, we are seeing improvements.
Yeah.
With complete streets policies and kids walking to school, students walking to school, safe routes to schools, pathways. That's great.
Yes, yes. And then we've brought the topic of, how do we ensure that all individuals, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their ethnicity, that they all have an equal opportunity to achieve the highest level of health available to them. And so when you start talking about that, you start looking at things like access to good housing and to living wage jobs and to good jobs where maybe you have some locum of control over scheduling and the kinds of things that if you don't have control over it, you're very stressed out, and that impacts your health. So those social determinants of health, as they're referred to, are really, really important and are really the main drivers of health outcomes. So we brought up the topic of living wages. We invited Jeff Furman, who was on the board of directors for the Ben & Jerry's Foundation and just Ben & Jerry's in general before it was purchased by Unilever. And they ensured that they understood the connection between wages and health, not only the health of their people, but the health of their business. And so they ensured that even when the company was taken over by Unilever, that they continued to pay living wages, whatever the going rate was in their communities.
So there were community partners that came to the summit and just individuals to learn more, and then they could figure out ways that they could start working to help those.
Yeah, we started what we called, well, I don't know if we called it this at the very beginning, but before the summit, about 9 or 10 months before the summit, we started convening some partners who at least had some understanding of the impact of the social determinants of health on health outcomes. And those folks came together, many different sectors of our community. There were business people, there were social service agency folks, there were hospital representatives, and they looked at, all right, well, what would this community dialogue around living wages look like? What's the kind of information we'd want to share? What's the living wage in the Monadnock region?
What is it?
What is it? So this group actually took about 4 or 5 months to create a methodology for calculating the living wage in the Monadnock region. And for a single adult, it's about $15 an hour.
Wow.
And so we wanted, as part of the dialogue, the community conversation at that summit, to talk about, here's how we figured out what the living wage was, here's the impact that it would have on health outcomes, here's how a community might start to take on this issue, and who are some other folks that are interested in at least the dialogue and in moving forward. And that early convening of folks led to 2 years later now, almost two years later now, we're getting ready to launch a living wage campaign in our community through this living wage work group.
Well, it sounds like I'll have to have another show focused just on living wages with some people from that work group, because I know they're doing a lot of work. Now let's spend some time talking about this year's summit, May 17th. What is the topic?
The topic is, I'm going to get the title wrong, but we're really going to be talking about addiction, substance abuse addiction, but from the perspective of what is some other ways of looking at how to treat it and prevent it?
Okay.
And our Healthiest Community Advisory Board, which has been supporting the providing sort of leadership and oversight of the overall Healthy Monadnock initiative since 2010, they also have chosen the topics for these.
Yeah, it's up on screen right now, so we can read the title. May 17th, A Tapestry of Hope, Preventing and Treating Addiction.
So that really came from our community members who are on this Healthiest Community Advisory Board saying, it's time for our community to not just talk about the problem of addiction, but let's talk about some perhaps some alternative solutions that maybe aren't as much in the mainstream, headlines of the heroin epidemic,
right.
and all of those sort of sensationalistic, facts and figures that we're hearing on a regular basis
right.
now.
Right.
But what are some solutions? What are some ways of thinking about this that are different? And that's really what the Healthiest Community Advisory Board was interested in. We don't want to do the same old, same old.
Yeah.
We want to look at what are other ways of thinking about this that may just have some answers for our community.
Mm-hmm. And I know we have a great speaker lined up. The keynote speaker is the author Johann Hari, author and journalist Johann Hari. Wrote the New York Times best-selling book, Chasing the Scream, which you have a copy of.
I do have a copy of it.
To share.
Yes.
And if we can pull it up, we have a clip from a TED Talk from Johann Hari to share with people that can hopefully give people an idea of these different, this different approach to substance abuse and addiction. Let's see if we can pull that up on screen.
In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis. But you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately £1 gazillion that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system.
Wow. I'm really excited to hear him at this show. I think it's going to be great. Now, you've read his book.
I've read 2/3 of his book.
You've read 2/3 of his book. And so he's really talking about that need to connect with people as being a lot of the driver of addiction. And I love that he mentions that it's not just the heroin. I mean, he's very clear about that. It's bonding with something else because we're lacking those other bonds. So,
yeah, sort of a drug is a drug is a drug. You know, whether it's the gambling, the slot machines, or nicotine, or alcohol, or heroin, or whatever. That's not as much the issue as what's the antidote.
Yeah.
You know, how do we address it?
Yeah. And there are many groups we see in the community that are already talking about these issues in various ways, and I think hopefully they can come to the summit and talk about and think about these new strategies and find ways to work together. I mean, who do you want to see at the summit this year?
Yeah. I'd like, folks from every sector of the community to be present at the summit and to be in a place of openness to hearing a different way of thinking about what it means to be addicted and where the hope and the solutions might be in addressing this issue, not just here in the Monadnock region, but statewide and nationwide. And because I think what Johann brings up is over and over again in the book is the fact that the so-called war on drugs, criminalizing drug addicts has not solved the problem. And it's like, that war on drugs has been around a long time. When do we say, I guess
maybe this isn't working.
Maybe this isn't working. Is it time to look at some other ways? Is it time to start funding some research that gets away from, sort of the chemical dependency piece of things, which he talks a lot about in the book, that people are chemically dependent and then they do all these bad things, and so we've got to, throw them in jail. That's not working.
Right.
It's not working, and I don't think there's anybody anymore that would, say that, oh yeah, that's working really well. We've seen a real reduction in, the addiction rate and the crime associated with addiction and the impact on families and on and on and on. Oh yeah, that's gotten better.
Right. The focus on the medical side as opposed to the preventative side and figuring out how you can...
Yeah, not just from prevention, but also in how do you treat addiction? How do you treat it? He talks about stories in here of researchers who, they maybe got a little bit of funding from some of the large funding sources in this country and other countries to look at more of the connection, the role between social connection and addiction. And they started to get some decent data, if you will, on where might the next level of research projects go. But these national organizations have not been willing to fund research that isn't based in, you have a chemical dependency, there's a change in your brain chemistry, that's the problem, and if we put you in jail enough times, we're going to beat that addiction out of you. So it would be great to start to see more and more communities talking about these other approaches so that there could be some funding to see, are there answers that are right in front of our faces that we're not moving towards because no researchers get the funding to look into them.
And I know he talks about some communities that have taken different approaches. He talks about Portugal in his TED Talk also, and I think Uruguay, which have taken the approach of legalizing many drugs and investing money in job creation programs and more social connection programs. And there's some really interesting stories around those communities.
Yes.
Did you want to share a quote from the book?
Oh, let's see.
I know you mentioned one.
Yes, there's so much good stuff in this book, and I highly recommend that folks get a copy of the book.
Yeah.
And
Chasing the
Scream. It is available in the Toadstool bookstore in both Keene and Peterborough. And it was interesting. Our county administrator, Chris Coates, and I were both reading the book at the same time.
Great.
And we haven't had a whole lot of time to sort of compare. What was your take? What was your take? But I remember him saying to me how angry the book has made him in terms of why we're not putting more funding into looking at some of these, alternative approaches from the standpoint of the war on drugs just not really not working.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my same, I mean, I'm not livid over it, but I would like to see there be more research into some of these other approaches. Johann talks about social recovery, and maybe I can read a little piece. This is from one of the scientists who had some early research that focused on the ability of social connection to heal people. He can't get funding to continue to study the work, but this is something that he talked about. His name's Bruce Alexander, and he said, human beings only become addicted when they cannot find anything better to live for, and when they desperately need to fill the emptiness that threatens to destroy them. The need to fill an inner void is not limited to people who become drug addicts, but afflicts the majority of people of the late modern era to a greater or lesser degree. So there's something happening in our society in terms of isolation. We have less friends, and we have much smaller social networks than we've ever had before, and that perhaps is making us sick in many ways, but making us more susceptible to seeking for a way out of our own isolation and to managing our own isolation. Fear talks a lot about fear, anxiety, isolation as sort of the drivers for wanting to escape your head, and looking for ways to do that, and that really has been something that people have been doing since we've got recordings of what people have done. We could look back at the Romans and the Greeks and, drugs and alcohol and other forms of escaping have been part of our culture as human beings since the beginning of time. So it's not out of our character to be looking for a way to escape our heads.
And now we have the screen time. People are always on their cell phones and the media, and that, I think, gets in the way. I think it's interesting how that ties back to the idea of more livable, walkable communities where you're interacting with your neighbors and friends and families more too. So a lot of these public health initiatives are tied together, which is why it's so important to have so many people at the table.
Absolutely. And, early on, before I was involved with the initiative, the folks that were coming together to determine what were the measures that we were going to use as a community to say that we had reached our vision of becoming the healthiest community in the nation, they understood that social connection was a real important piece of the puzzle. That was back in 2007, where they were saying, well, we've got to have some measures in the then it was called Vision 2020. We have to have some indicators that measure social connection, because even though there's not a ton of research that can prove the connection, between health and social connection, there's enough to hint at it's a real important factor. And so we've been measuring.
How are we measuring that right now?
We look at things like, and there aren't great measures out there for this, but we've been monitoring things like the how often people have people over for dinner. That's one of the indicators that measures social connection. How many groups beyond your family network are you associated with?
Okay.
So those are the kind of things that start to get at what does your social network look like?
Yeah.
And the idea is that the stronger your network is, the more people are involved, the more support you have, the better your health outcomes are.
Okay.
The better you feel about the world, the less isolated you feel, the less afraid you feel, because you have more people to go to ask for help. And so.
Yeah, well, we don't have much time left in this show, so I want to make sure we talk again about how people can register for the summit. I hope everyone comes out on May 17th for the summit. You can go to the Healthy Monadnock website to register. It's healthymonadnock.org. There's a link right in the center of the website. Tapestry of Hope, Preventing and Treating Addiction. Any last thoughts that you want to mention about the summit and who we want to see there?
We want everybody to come to the summit, and we also want people to read the book and start talking about it in their own social networks. If this idea of social connection resonates with people at all, how can we incorporate this into our approaches to dealing with our heroin epidemic and our other issues around substance misuse, both prevention and treatment in our community? So conversation starter, but more than that, it's a different way of thinking about a really old issue that I think is worthy of the conversation.
It's a really exciting topic. We're so lucky to have this in our community. So thank you, Linda, for joining me today. This has been a great show. I look forward to the summit. I hope everyone goes to the website and signs up for the summit. Come out, talk with us, talk with your friends. Check it out. Thanks for joining us today. This is Healthy Monadnock Heartbeat. I'm Sarah Caseta, and I look forward to seeing you next time.